In American culture, World War II occupies a near sacred space. It's remembered as a noble crusade in which the United States emerged as the heroic liberator of Europe and the Pacific. This narrative is comforting to millions of Americans, but I've done my research and it's wrong. While the United States undeniably played a major role in the Allied victory, its self-image as the decisive and virtuous force in World War II is a distortion that ignores critical realities. From underestimating the Soviet Union's central role to misrepresenting the use of the atomic bomb, America's memory of World War II is less about historical accuracy and more about national myth-making. In this video, we're debunking some of the myths of the American World War II narrative to explain what really happened. Now, perhaps one of the most glaring omissions to Americans is the scale of the Soviet Union's contribution and sacrifice in defeating Nazi Germany. In fact, many Americans likely wouldn't even know that the Soviet Union played such a major role. However, much of the war was fought along what is known as the Eastern Front. And one of the most important battles of the war was the Battle of Stalingrad, which allowed for the encirclement and destruction of the Germany's Sixth Army and let the Soviets move towards Berlin on behalf of the Allies. By the war's end, around 80% of all German military deaths occurred on the Eastern Front, and the Soviet Union lost over 27 million people, including civilians. It's often said that World War II was won with British intelligence, American steel, and Russian blood. But despite these staggering figures when it comes to the Soviets, American cultural memory really erases Soviet involvement. In part, this can be traced to Cold War propaganda, which sought to minimize Soviet accomplishments and cast the USSR as an adversary, not a wartime ally. Even today, American school textbooks and war films really rarely acknowledge the extent to which the Soviet Union helped win the war for the Allies. Number 2. America was not the reluctant savior. A foundational part of the American myth is the idea that the US was reluctantly dragged into the war by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy, and the narrative of sudden, unprovoked aggression has been used to frame the US role as one of reactive justice rather than proactive ambition. In truth, America was already involved in the war long before Pearl Harbor, economically, diplomatically, and ideologically. Through the Lend-Lease Act of 1941, the United States provided over $50 billion, equivalent to around $750 billion today, in war supplies to the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, China, and other allies. Roosevelt had long been preparing the country for war, even while publicly maintaining a stance of neutrality in order to navigate Congress and public opinion. Moreover, American sanctions and embargoes against Japan, particularly on oil, were deliberately designed to deter Japanese expansion in Asia. Historian Charles Beard, a prominent critic of Roosevelt's foreign policy, argued that the administration knowingly pursued policies that would force Japan's hand. While such claims remain controversial, they underscore this other idea that perhaps Pearl Harbor was the climax of escalating tensions between the US and Japan that the US had helped cultivate. The image of America as a reluctant participant erases the strategic calculations and growing global ambitions that motivated intervention. The war offered an opportunity to America to assert American influence and establish a post-war order aligned with US economic and political interests. Next up on my list has to do with the atomic bombs. American textbooks often assert that the atomic bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima were necessary to end the war and save lives, typically citing the estimated 500,000 American casualties that might have resulted from a land invasion of Japan. However, many senior military leaders at the time questioned the necessity of using nuclear weapons. General Dwight D. Eisenhower later wrote, "I voiced to him, speaking to the Secretary of War, my grave misgivings, first on the basis of my belief that Japan was already defeated and that dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary." Similarly, another admiral stated, "The use of this weapon was of no material assistance in our war against Japan." Japan had already been devastated by conventional firebombing campaigns, the destruction of infrastructure, and a tightening naval blockade. In July of 1945, the US intercepted messages indicating that Japanese leaders were seeking terms for surrender, primarily the preservation of the emperor. In early August, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion, delivering a psychological and strategic blow that many historians consider the final push towards surrender. So, why use the bombs? Increasingly, scholars argue that the atomic bombs were at least partially intended to send a message to the Soviet Union. The US wanted to end the war swiftly and decisively, not just to save lives, but to control the post-war geopolitical landscape without Soviet interference in Japan. One historian wrote in his book, The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb, that the bomb's use was the first act of the Cold War. Now let's talk about the myth of the American military as the decisive force. Hollywood, television, and national commemoration have helped create the impression in America that American soldiers were the principal liberators of Europe and the Pacific. While American troops absolutely did fight bravely and effectively across the warfront, the reality is that victory came through an enormous and often messy coalition effort. American military supremacy was neither automatic nor singularly decisive. The British Empire played a central role in resisting Axis aggression long before the United States entered the war. After the fall of France in 1940, Britain stood alone in Europe against Nazi Germany for more than a year, enduring relentless bombing during the Battle of Britain, the first significant defeat for Hitler's military. British pilots fought off the Germans in a campaign that Winston Churchill would later praise and say, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Britain also led numerous campaigns in North Africa, the Mediterranean, and Southeast Asia. The British 8th Army, under commanders like Montgomery, played a decisive role in the defeat of German and Italian forces in North Africa, particularly around 1942. This was what Churchill called the end of the beginning. Meanwhile, British and Commonwealth forces fought grueling jungle campaigns against the Japanese in Burma, often under harsh conditions and with little recognition in the American-dominated narrative. In Europe, the Royal Navy kept vital Atlantic supply lines open, while British intelligence services, including the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, made significant contributions to the Allied war effort, most famously by cracking the German Enigma code. And even after American forces arrived in large numbers, the war remained a joint effort. The D-Day invasion itself was a British-led operation, the overall commander of naval forces was a British admiral, and 2 of the 5 landing beaches, Gold and Sword, were taken by British forces. Canada took a third. British and Commonwealth troops continued fighting side by side with Americans throughout the campaigns across Europe. But by focusing exclusively on American heroism, popular culture in the States erases the efforts of Britain and its vast imperial forces, millions of soldiers from India, Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the Caribbean, all of whom played indispensable roles in the Allied victory. Historian James Holland notes in The War in the West that the war in Europe and North Africa would have been completely unwinnable without British leadership and persistence, particularly in the early years when America was not yet engaged. Even US technological and industrial prowess, while very impressive, we're not taking away from that, it tells only part of the story. Britain, under total wartime mobilization and subjected to daily bombing, produced tanks, aircraft, and warships in remarkable numbers. They innovated in radar, and they sustained a global navy. The Allied victory was not the work of one nation. It was the product of global cooperation, shared sacrifice, and overlapping strengths. The myth of America as this singular military force not only distorts history, but also disrespects the immense contributions of Britain and the broader Allies. And finally, the dominant American narrative frames World War II as a stark battle between good and evil, democracy versus fascism, which is very important in today's day and age. While the Axis powers undeniably committed horrific crimes, the Allies were far from morally flawless. The US military, for example, remained racially segregated during the war, and African American troops were often relegated to menial labor and non-combat roles. Japanese Americans were forcibly interned in camps on US soil, a blatant violation of constitutional rights later admitted to have been driven by racism and hysteria rather than military necessity. Meanwhile, Allied bombing campaigns, including the firebombing of Dresden and Tokyo, killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. As Roosevelt aligned with Joseph Stalin, the idea of a purely virtuous alliance breaks down. Yet, American memory tends to gloss over these contradictions in favor of a cleaner and more palatable story. The war's aftermath also complicates the narrative. Far from ushering in a new era of peace, the end of World War II immediately transitioned into the Cold War, with America asserting dominance through military alliances, covert interventions, and nuclear brinkmanship. In the book The Politics of War, historian historian Gabriel Kolko argues that US wartime policies were driven as much by the desire to shape the post-war world as by opposition to fascism. He says American leaders were never content with a victory over the Axis. They sought to shape the entire future of global power. Now that brings me to the end of this episode. I hope you learned something new about the history of World War II. I'm sure many of you have much more to comment below, so leave it in the comments. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.